Wow. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
And I know I just have a few minutes to speak to you, but I'm incredibly moved. By the way, Nettie Washington Douglass, in case you didn't get the connection, is my mother. Yesterday, please forgive me, I know I just have a few minutes, but I have some things on my heart that I feel that I want to talk about, that just I've been moved by your presentation, the music. Yesterday, we spent the whole day commemorating the life of our great ancestor. We were out on the eastern shore of Maryland at Talbot County, dedicating a park to him in a big ceremony. We visited Ron Brown School and had a chance to talk to students about the life of my great ancestor. And last night, we ended up at the Capitol in front of the Frederick Douglass statue that was dedicated in 2013. And there were leaders from both sides of the aisle that were in attendance. And sitting right next to each other were Leader Nancy Pelosi and Speaker Paul Ryan. And when I looked out in the audience as I was giving my remarks and I saw them sitting together right there in the front row with all of the divisiveness and hatred that's going on in our country, and really what's been there since the founding of the country, but has been brought to light. And we've always believed that Frederick Douglass's spirit could unify us. When I was younger, there were a lot of statues that I saw of Frederick Douglass, and they were always looking down at me. And when you're a little boy, and we've all seen the photographs of the great man and his stern, steely glare, and as a little boy, that used to scare me. And I would look at him sometimes and I would think, man, you look mean. And I'm glad I didn't know you. And there was a portrait in our family beach house at Highland Beach, Maryland on the Chesapeake Bay, which was built by my great-great-grandfather Charles, Frederick's youngest son, to be a retirement home for his father. And it sat right on the Chesapeake Bay, and I spent all of my summers at that home. And my mom talked about this yesterday at the park dedication, that there's this larger-than-life portrait of Frederick Douglass, and we would look at it and think, wow, and try and tiptoe and sneak past it, and you know what would happen when we would do that? His eyes would follow us. This is the first time that I've ever seen him at my eye level. It looks just like him. I'd like to say hello to, please stand up, Professor Dale Green from Morgan State, my good friend, who's been working tirelessly on Frederick Douglass-related activities and carrying the legacy and just working so hard. What I wanted to talk to you about, which I just felt inspired to do right now, is we've created a project called 1 Million Abolitionists, as you heard Mr. Redmond mention. And thank you very much for inviting me to be here. And I'm really sorry I didn't get a chance to meet Dr. Martin in person, but her words were lovely and just have filled me up with a lot of inspiration to continue this work that we're doing. And what we've decided to do is publish a special bicentennial edition of Frederick Douglass's narrative, his first autobiography, that was published in 1845. He was 27 years old when he wrote it. He was a fugitive slave, having never spent one day of his life in a classroom, because as we know, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. But yet, this boy would rise up from slavery and go on to positively affect change in the lives of millions of people. And when we were looking at what we wanted to do around the foundation of the project, and also which is at the foundation of the work we do around human trafficking prevention, education in schools, we go in and we train educators and teachers on how to deliver a prevention curricula so that our children are not prostituted and trafficked for sex and for labor. Continuing the legacy of Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, and my great-great-grandfather Booker T. Washington as the great educator and founder of Tuskegee. And at the foundation of everything that we do is Frederick Douglass's story, where he had been born on the eastern shore of Maryland into slavery. He was chosen from among all of the children on that plantation to go to Baltimore. This is another reason why I'm so emotional, because I'm standing on sacred ground. It's where Frederick Douglass taught himself to read and write, and it's where he had this courage to escape from at the age of 20. And when he gets to Baltimore, his slave mistress had never had an enslaved person before. And she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. And she began to teach young Frederick his ABCs. But when his master found out about it, we know the story, he got angry and he forbade the teaching, and he looked at Frederick and he looked at his wife, Sophia Auld, and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." You all heard that message. And you know what? Our young people hear that message too. And they do the same thing. They bob their heads and a light bulb goes off. And in the same way, Frederick looked at his master and he said, if you don't want me to have this education, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power, and education would be his pathway to freedom. And as he goes about unfitting himself to be enslaved, he starts to ask critical questions about his condition of oppression and enslavement. And he asks questions like, why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And he would look to God and he would ask God, he said, "God, do you mean for me to be a slave for life? Because I can't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday, goes to church, and in the Word and in the Bible and cherry-pick verses finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, exploit, rape, pillage, and plunder his property. I can't wrap my mind around that." And we know that when he first learned to read, one of the first books that he read was the Bible. And in the Bible, he found that God loved him. And God did not mean for him to be a slave. God did not mean for him to be a slave for life. And so he made a distinction later on in life when he wrote his narrative between the Christianity and the slave-holding religion of the land and what he differentiated as the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. And so, as I mentioned, he had the courage to go ahead and eventually escape from slavery from Baltimore. And so with the publication of this book, we wanted to inspire young people everywhere with Frederick Douglass's words. My mom and I both can tell you that our whole lives, we've had people of all ages and all races come up to us, many times with tears in their eyes. I remember older ladies and men, and they would pinch my cheeks and kiss me on the cheek and pat me on the head and hug me, and I'm looking at them and I'm trying to figure out what is this emotional connection to my ancestors, Douglass and to Washington. I was too young to appreciate and understand that. And it wasn't until a few years ago a lady approached my mom at an event and with tears in her eyes, and she said that Frederick Douglass meant so much in her life. She was introduced to the narrative when she was in middle school. and that if she could thank him because he inspired her to be a leader in her church, in her community, and in the corporate world, and to be a philanthropist and to give back in the community. If she could thank Frederick for all of that, then she would. But because she couldn't, my mom became the conduit to saying thank you. And so we know how this legacy and the spirit of Frederick Douglass inspires people. And so we've published this book. We're going to give away 1 million copies by the end of 2018. Every piece of this book, the narrative itself appears exactly as it did in 1845, but Brian Stevenson, whom you may know as the author of Just Mercy, a New York Times bestseller, and also the founder and CEO of the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery, Alabama. He's a leading voice and an attorney by trade, and he works on issues of mass incarceration, prison industrial complex, and he wrote a powerful introduction. I heard the gentleman mention about history and it being whitewashed and the contributions of Native Americans and African Americans have been erased from the freedom narrative in this country. It has not been erased from this book. And Brian breaks down hundreds of years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, housing discrimination, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, all the way to this legal institution that we call mass incarceration. And so Frederick Douglass escapes, and he looks back at the legal institution of slavery. We've got problems today, we know that. But can you imagine what that would have been like to look at this institution knowing that your federal government said it's legal to enslave you and illegal to teach you? Most of us probably would run away from that and just say that's too big an issue for us to be able to do something about. But thank goodness Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists and the other great heroes and heroines at that time didn't run away from it, or we would be a very different country than we are today. So we launched this project in February of last year at the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress named this book one of the 88 books that shaped America. Again, I'll remind you, it was written by a man who never spent one day of his life in a classroom. People would see Frederick Douglass later in life, and they would see this white-haired statesman, and they would say, Frederick, where did you go to school? They had to know, where did you get your education? And he would respond on occasion by saying, my degree is written on my back. And he writes this classic piece of literature that 174 years later, we're still talking about. And so imagine the power of putting this book into the hands of young people everywhere, because I know when I sit in a classroom in Baltimore, I sit in a classroom in Miami or Los Angeles or Atlanta or Chicago or Flint, Michigan, that there is a Frederick Douglass sitting there, that there's a Sojourner Truth sitting there, a Rosa Parks, a Fannie Lou Hamer, a Cesar Chavez, Susan B. Anthony. Pick your freedom fighter of choice. They're out there, and we can inspire them to effect change in the world around them. And I am very happy to announce that we have received funding so far for 1,000 books for Baltimore. And working with Professor Dale Green, we're going to get more money so that we can bring thousands and thousands of books to the schools in Baltimore and the organizations that serve the youth population that would benefit from this book. That's what we're going to do, because this should be the epicenter of our project for a national conversation and a national discussion around the issues that we're most concerned about and that our young people are concerned about. And they're concerned because I talk to them. I know they're concerned about inequality. I know they're concerned about injustice. I know that they're concerned about disparities and lack of education and health care. And the list goes on and on and on. And we know that they can affect change around this issue. So I had a young boy in Baltimore. I was at a barbershop, a 16-year-old African-American boy. We were talking about Frederick Douglass and how when he would get food on occasion, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a pig's trough. And all of the children, including Frederick, would crawl on their hands and knees to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs and to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself. Someone else owned him. He was no better than the sheep and the cattle and the horses and the pigs. But if we know our Frederick Douglass story in Baltimore, after Sophia Auld gave him that little spark of light into his mental darkness, he started to teach himself to read and write. And he traded bread for reading lessons. Now, what does that say about the value of education, that a boy that had to eat out of a pig's trough would trade food for lessons, for the opportunity for literacy? It means, and our students get it. They say right away, it means, you know what, Mr. Morris, it means he would rather feed his mind than feed his stomach. Frederick Douglass's words and his writings are as relevant today as they were all those years ago. And we heard that. What to the slave is your 4th of July? And talking about a country that would espouse freedom and liberty while enslaving people on their soil, enslaving human beings on this blood-soaked soil in the United States. And Frederick Douglass said, we are guilty of sins that would disgrace a nation of savages. At this very hour, this country is still guilty of sins that would disgrace a nation of savages at this very hour. But you know what? I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because Frederick Douglass said that without struggle, there is no progress. And we're going to struggle. We have been struggling. But I'm hopeful that on the other end that we're going to come out a better country and better people loving each other and treating each other as God would have us treat each other. And this was affirmed, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind me sharing this story, but I sat down with Congressman John Lewis right before the holidays. And we were having a conversation about where we are in the political climate and environment. And I asked him, I said, I just need to know this from you. Are you hopeful, or do you think that we're really in a bad space? And he had tears welling up in his eyes, and he said, in his very soft-spoken manner and his soft-spoken quietness and strength, he said, I'm very hopeful. And so when we start having conversations that this book and this project are going to start in classrooms everywhere, we're going to be raising up children who are going to have more compassion. They're going to show more love. There's going to be more understanding for our differences. That's going to happen from this book, but it's going to take a lot more than that, I realize it. But what did Frederick Douglass say? He said, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And he also said, I prayed for 20 years, but my prayers weren't answered until I prayed with my legs. So what we're talking about here with a project like this is literacy, and we're talking about social service, we're talking about activism, civic engagement, and in the same way that Frederick Douglass started to look at how do we dismantle an institution like slavery. And so back to the young boy, 16-year-old boy in the barbershop in Albany, New York, talked about having to eat out of a pig's trough, and then Sophia Auld beginning his lessons, and the little boy, the 16-year-old boy said to me, he said, Mr. Morris, if I could describe in my mind what I feel like every single day, it's like a dark, pitch black hallway with no windows and no doors. But what you just said to me about Frederick Douglass shined a little bit of light into my mental darkness, and I can start to point toward the direction so that I can get out of this. We spend a lot of time talking about history, how history lives in all of us. We all don't descend from somebody that we've heard of, but each and every one of us descends from somebody that made a difference, that sacrificed so much, may have given of their lives just so that some of us can even sit in a classroom and get an education. May have given up their lives for the freedoms that we do have in this country today. And we stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us. A 10-year-old girl, again, raised her hand. These students, we've collected all of these stories, and I remember some of these questions because they really have impacted me over the years of doing this work. She said, "Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree, and I found that my great-great-great-great-grandmother, 4 greats, was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write in secret, and then she ran away. She became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist." And she said, "So do you know what that means?" And before I had a chance to answer, she said, "It means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do." We all have greatness flowing through our veins. And history lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forward. Because we are the sons and daughters. And we're the grandsons and granddaughters. We're the products of slavery. This country is the product of slavery. But this country is also the product of the abolition of slavery. And from Frederick Douglass, we learned that we have a right to be free. And from Booker T. Washington, we learned how to make our way in the world as free citizens. And from Martin Luther King Jr., we learned that as free citizens, we have the same rights as all citizens. When I was growing up, the challenges faced by great men like my ancestors were apparent to me because it just so happens their blood flows through my veins. But the fact is, all of us, we live far from the cotton fields. We live far from carrying those bales of cotton on our back. We're worried more about our favorite sports team winning a ball game than we are about the threat of being beaten by our overseers. But we live in modern times, and the echoes of slavery are hard to hear from where we stand. But if we all listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from all of the young people out there that need hope, need inspiration. They need to know where they've come from. Our young people, and everybody in here knows, our young people do not know where they come from, but it's not their fault. I understand the reasons why these stories were not passed down through the generation when you're coming out of hundreds of years of trauma, with no plan for emancipation, no counseling, no post-traumatic stress disorder designation. Families had been separated from each other, didn't own anything. Many couldn't read and write, didn't have land, just came out of slavery with a burlap on your back and just go ahead and just figure it out your own self. So I understand why our young people don't know where they come from, but we descend from people that overcame and survived, and I am proud to call myself an African American. And when our young people know that that strength is flowing through their veins and that resilience is flowing through their veins, you see them sitting up straighter in their chairs. You see them more empowered and enlightened and engaged. And we as a community, when we continue to come together around building strong children and supporting our kids, and I know everybody in here is doing that, so I'm preaching to the choir, I understand that, but just in thinking about this from a bigger picture, but having the foundation of history be what sets us on the right course. Because when our children know, I'm telling you, it just changes everything. I've seen it over and over and over again, but we need your help to do this on a larger scale. And so I come back to the place that Baltimore has to be the epicenter of our project. And if you like what you're hearing about this project, and I'm going to close here in a second. I know you gave me 3 minutes. I'm sorry. And I was late. But I had this on my heart, and I just couldn't not come up here and talk to you about this. And so I want to read what Brian wrote in his introduction, the last paragraph. There's another section in here called What the Narrative Means to Me, and that's young people, students, who wrote blurbs about how Frederick Douglass's narrative inspired them. And that's my favorite section in this whole book, because all of these years later, it's very humbling to be a descendant of Frederick Douglass and know that he can still impact people in the way that he still does. So Brian writes, Frederick Douglass wrote that education, let me start over. Frederick Douglass wrote that, quote, education means emancipation. It means light and liberty. It means the uplifting of the soul of man into the glorious light of truth, the light by which men can only be made free, end quote. Then Brian writes, we're living at a time when we need the glorious light of truth, people who are willing to stand when others say sit down. We need people committed to equality who will speak when others say be quiet. It can be difficult to know how to face some of these overwhelming challenges. Let the words and life of Frederick Douglass show you the way. And with that, I thank you all very much for listening to my story, and God bless you. Thank you.